Top 1. The Tambora eruption. On the evening of April 10th, 1815, on the island of Sumbawa in present-day Indonesia, a mountain tore itself apart. Mount Tambora had been silent for centuries. Then, without warning, it released the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The explosion was heard over 2,600 kilometers away. People in Sumatra mistook the sound for cannon fire. Soldiers were dispatched to find an enemy that did not exist. The enemy was geology itself. In the hours that followed, three enormous plumes of fire rose from the summit and merged into one. Pyroclastic flows, rivers of burning gas and rock moving at hurricane speed, swept every village on the peninsula into the sea. The mountain lost approximately 1,401 miles of its own height in a single night. Around 100 kilometers of material was blasted into the sky. Ash fell over a meter deep within 75 kilometers of the volcano. Within 600 kilometers, the sky turned completely black for 3 days. Roughly 71,000 people died, but that number tells only the smallest part of the story. The sulfate gases Tambora pumped into the upper atmosphere did not fall back down. They spread. They circled the entire planet. They formed an invisible aerosol cloud that blocked incoming sunlight and quietly began to cool the Earth. By 1816, that cooling had a name. People called it the year without a summer. In New England, snow fell in June. Frost destroyed crops in July. Temperatures dropped so fast that lakes in northwestern Pennsylvania remained frozen well into what should have been harvest season. Entire farming communities in Vermont and Maine abandoned their land and fled west. Grain prices collapsed after a brief boom. And in 1819, the United States experienced its first major economic depression, known as the Panic of 1819, partly triggered by the agricultural chaos Tambora had set in motion. Across the Atlantic, 6 writers trapped indoors by relentless storms and cold near Lake Geneva in the summer of 1816 held a ghost story competition. One of them was an 18-year-old named Mary Shelley. The story she wrote that night became Frankenstein, widely considered the first science fiction novel ever written. She had no idea a volcano in Indonesia had locked her inside. Meanwhile, in the Bay of Bengal, Tambora's disruption of the Indian monsoon for 2 consecutive years altered the disease ecology of the region so severely that it gave rise to a new and deadly strain of cholera. That strain spread out of Bengal and killed tens of millions of people across Asia, Europe, and beyond in a pandemic that lasted until 1823. In China's Yunnan province, 3 years of failed rice harvests left people eating white clay to survive. Out of desperation, farmers turned to the one crop that could endure the cold and still earn money. They planted opium. Within decades, Yunnan had become a central hub of global narcotics production, seeding what would eventually become the Golden Triangle, the most infamous drug-producing region on Earth. One volcano, one night, a century reshaped without a single declaration of war. Top 2. Doggerland's disappearance. There is land sitting at the bottom of the North Sea right now. It has rivers, hills, valleys, and forests. It was once one of the most fertile and productive landscapes in all of Europe. People lived there, hunted there, built their lives there. Then the ocean swallowed it whole, and Britain has been an island ever since. Around 10,000 BC, as the last ice age came to an end and glaciers began to melt, a vast landmass connected what is now Britain to the European continent. Archaeologists call it Doggerland. It was not a narrow strip of muddy ground. It stretched from the eastern coast of England all the way to the Netherlands and Denmark, covering an area that researchers describe as larger than the Netherlands itself. It had rivers feeding into what would become the Thames, the Rhine, and the Seine. It had marshes, lagoons, lakes, and dense woodlands. By any measure, it was paradise for the Mesolithic people who lived there. Those people were hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons, following animals, fishing the rivers, gathering hazelnuts and berries. Researchers believe the population of Doggerland may have reached at least 10,000 people at its height, and some archaeologists have described it as possibly the most densely populated region in northwestern Europe during the Mesolithic period. They left behind stone tools, barbed antler harpoons, and human bones, all now resting silently on the seafloor, recovered occasionally by North Sea fishing trawlers whose nets drag up fragments of a civilization most people have never heard of. But the sea was rising slowly, steadily, as the climate warmed. The edges of Doggerland began to flood. By around 9000 BC, what had once been open plains began transforming into a shrinking archipelago of islands. The people adapted. They moved to higher ground. They retreated. Then came the event that ended it. Around 6200 BC, on the edge of Norway's continental shelf in the Norwegian Sea, one of the largest underwater landslides in recorded geological history occurred. Known as the Storegga Slide, the collapse involved approximately 290 kilometers of coastal shelf and displaced an estimated 3,500 kilometers of debris into the ocean floor. The displacement sent a massive tsunami radiating outward across the North Atlantic. When those waves reached the coast of what remained of Doggerland, they struck with a force that reshaped the landscape permanently. Sediment deposits from the tsunami have been found in Scotland up to 29 kilometers inland and 4 meters above current sea level. Wave heights along the Shetland Islands are estimated to have exceeded 20 miles. Whatever land remained above water in Doggerland was swept. Whatever communities had held on were gone. It is estimated that up to a quarter of the Mesolithic population of Britain lost their lives. The Dogger Bank, the last raised section of the old landmass, eventually sank beneath the surface as sea levels continued rising. No war ended Doggerland, no plague, no collapse of trade. The ocean simply rose, and then a wall of water came, and an entire world that had existed for thousands of years ceased to exist. The people who escaped became the isolated inhabitants of an island they had not chosen to live on. Britain's separation from Europe was not a political decision. It was geology. Top 3. The Zanclean Megaflood. Where the Mediterranean Sea sits today, there was once a desert, not a shallow bay, not a quiet lagoon. A vast, sunken, scorched wasteland stretching more than 3 kilometers below the level of the world's oceans. A place where the sun beat down on cracked, salt flats and dried riverbeds, where temperatures on the basin floor may have soared to extreme levels, and where almost nothing lived. This was not a myth. It was the Earth roughly 5.96 million years ago. And what happened next was the largest flood in the recorded history of this planet. To understand the catastrophe, you have to understand what came before it. The Mediterranean Sea had always depended on the Atlantic Ocean. The two were connected through what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, and that connection kept the Mediterranean full. But around 596 million years ago, tectonic activity gradually uplifted the land barrier between them. The connection was cut. The Mediterranean, sitting in one of the most arid climates on Earth, began to evaporate. The net loss of water each year was enormous. Rivers flowing in from the surrounding continents could not keep pace. The sea shrank. The salt concentrated. Marine life collapsed. Less than 11% of Mediterranean species survived the conditions. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the basin dried into a colossal salt desert, leaving behind evaporate deposits, layers of gypsum, halite, and salt in some places over 1 kilometer thick, covering an area of roughly 2.5 million square kilometers. Scientists who drilled into the Mediterranean seafloor in the early 1970s found these layers buried hundreds of meters beneath the surface, and were so shocked by what they recovered that they initially questioned whether their own data was correct. This period is now called the Messinian salinity crisis, and it lasted approximately 640,000 years. Then 5.33 million years ago, the barrier broke. Atlantic water found a weakness in the land at what is now the Strait of Gibraltar. A small stream began cutting through rock and sediment. As it eroded, the channel widened. As the channel widened, the flow accelerated. As the flow accelerated, the erosion became catastrophic. Models of the event estimate that at its peak, the flood discharged over 100 million cubic meters of water per second, approximately 1,000 times the discharge of the modern Amazon River. Water velocities reached over 40 miles per second. The channel being carved through Gibraltar deepened as the water cut through it, and the deeper it became, the faster the water moved. And the faster the water moved, the deeper the channel became. It was a self-reinforcing torrent on a geological scale. Water poured into the empty basin from a height of roughly 1 kilometer, falling into a void. 90% of the entire Mediterranean refilled in a period scientists estimate at somewhere between several months and 2 years. Sea level within the basin rose at rates exceeding 10 mm per day. An erosion channel nearly 390-kilometer long and several hundred meters deep, running from the Gulf of Cadiz into the western Mediterranean, is the scar that flood left behind. It still sits on the seafloor. Over 300 streamlined ridges in southeast Sicily, shaped by the force of the water pouring through, were identified by researchers as recently as 2025 as direct evidence of the flood's second phase as it spilled into the eastern basin. The Mediterranean did not form slowly, it was poured. Top 4. Rome's silent killer. In 165 AD, the Roman Empire was at the height of everything it had ever built. The population stood at roughly 75 million people. The army was the most disciplined fighting force in the world. Roads connected every corner of the known world back to a single city. The Pax Romana, a stretch of relative peace that had lasted nearly 2 centuries, was still intact. The historian Cassius Dio would later describe the reign of Marcus Aurelius as a kingdom of gold. Then the soldiers came home from Mesopotamia. The campaign had been a success. Co-emperor Lucius Verus led Roman legions deep into Parthian territory, sacking the great cities of Seleucia and Ctesiphon along the Tigris River. The army returned victorious in early 166 AD, marching westward along Rome's own roads, moving through garrison towns, supply depots, even port cities. They carried the spoils of war. They also carried something else, a disease that no one in the Roman world had ever encountered before. The population had no immunity, none at all. The disease moved like fire through dry grass. It followed the roads, the rivers, and the trade routes. It reached the Rhine frontier, then Gaul, then the city of Rome itself. The Greek physician Galen, who witnessed the outbreak firsthand, documented the symptoms in clinical detail. Victims endured violent fevers and severe diarrhea. Their throats swelled painfully. On roughly the 9th day of illness, dark pustules erupted across the skin, sometimes wet, sometimes dry, covering the entire body inside and out. Some patients coughed up or passed scabs that had formed internally. Survivors were left permanently scarred. Many did not survive. Based on Galen's descriptions, most modern medical historians believe the disease was an early strain of smallpox, striking a population that had never been exposed to it before. At the peak of the outbreak in Rome, Cassius Dio recorded that 2,000 people died in the city on a single day. Over the 15 years the plague swept through the empire in repeated waves, estimates placed the total death toll at somewhere between 5 and 10 million people, roughly 10% of the entire empire's population, with mortality in some cities and military units reaching as high as 25 to 30%. The damage to the Roman army was catastrophic. The legions were the backbone of Rome's power, and they were devastated. Faced with simultaneous invasions along the Danube by Germanic tribes during the Marcomannic Wars, Marcus Aurelius had no choice but to fill the empty ranks with slaves, gladiators, and criminals. For the first time in over 2 centuries, Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into Roman territory. The empire that had never needed to beg for soldiers was now recruiting from the bottom of society to defend its own borders. The economic collapse was just as severe. Agricultural land in Egypt shrank dramatically. Tax revenues fell across the empire. Civic construction projects that had defined Rome's prosperous 2nd century simply stopped. Marcus Aurelius, in a gesture that shocked the Roman world, auctioned off gold and silver furnishings from his own imperial palace to pay for the wars. And in the silence left by 5 million dead, a small and previously persecuted religious movement began to grow. The Christian communities were among the very few who continued caring for the sick when everyone else fled. That visible compassion in the middle of mass death attracted converts by the thousands. The Antonine Plague did not just weaken Rome militarily and economically. It quietly handed the future of the Western world to a faith that Rome had been trying to suppress. 19th century historian Barthold Georg Niebuhr wrote plainly that the empire never recovered from the blow. The golden age that Cassius Dio admired so much had a precise end date. It ended the moment those soldiers walked back through the gate. Top 5. The Black Sea Flood. There is a drowned world sitting at the bottom of the Black Sea. Ancient shorelines, submerged river valleys. the shells of freshwater snails that have not lived in those waters for over 7,000 years. And according to two geologists from Columbia University, this underwater landscape is the most compelling physical evidence ever found for one of the oldest stories in human history. In 1997, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, both senior scientists at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, published findings that permanently changed how researchers think about prehistoric catastrophe. Using sediment cores pulled from the Black Sea floor, they proposed that around 5,600 BC, the Black Sea was not a sea at all. It was a freshwater lake, a large, fertile inhabited freshwater lake sitting well below the level of the world's oceans. And it was separated from the Mediterranean by a single land barrier, a natural dam of earth running through what is now the Bosphorus Strait in present-day Turkey. The land around that lake was productive and populated. Neolithic farming communities had settled its shores during a cold, dry period when fresh water was scarce across the surrounding region. The lake was an oasis. People built homes there, farmed there, and raised families there for generations. Nobody knew what was building on the other side of the dam. As the last ice age ended and global temperatures rose, the world's oceans were quietly climbing. Glaciers were melting, sea levels were lifting, the Mediterranean was filling, and the earthen barrier at the Bosphorus was absorbing pressure it was never meant to hold indefinitely. Then it gave way. Ryan and Pittman described what followed as a waterfall with 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. Mediterranean salt water came screaming through the breach and plunged downward into the freshwater lake below. In a single day, enough water poured through the channel to cover an area the size of Manhattan many times over. The roar of the cascading water, they calculated, would have been audible from over 100 miles away. The Bosphorus flume ran at full force for an estimated 300 days. By the time it slowed, the Black Sea had risen approximately a 150 meter. An area of roughly 155,000 square kilometers of formerly dry inhabited land had vanished permanently beneath salt water. Every home, every field, every settlement on those shores was gone. The people who lived there fled in every direction into Europe, into Anatolia, into Mesopotamia, into Egypt, carrying their farming knowledge, their languages, and the memory of what had happened with them. The sediment cores confirm the story with brutal precision. Beneath dozens of feet of modern seafloor, Ryan and Pittman found layered river delta mud, freshwater mollusk shells, and dried cracked soil. The unmistakable fingerprint of land that had been above water and then abruptly drowned. There was no gradual transition. The freshwater record simply stopped, replaced immediately by marine deposits. The shift was instantaneous by geological standards. In 1999 and 2000, the oceanographer Robert Ballard, the same man who found the Titanic, led underwater expeditions off the Turkish coast near Sinop. His team located ancient drowned shorelines at roughly 100 meters of depth, recovered freshwater snail shells from the submerged landscape, and found what appeared to be a man-made structure sitting on a submerged hill approximately 12 miles offshore. The structure could not be definitively dated, but it sat precisely where a Neolithic settlement would have stood before the flood arrived. The hypothesis remains contested. Some researchers argue the flooding was less catastrophic and more gradual than Ryan and Pittman proposed. But the core evidence, the drowned landscape, the abrupt salinity shift in the sediment record, the submerged shorelines is not disputed. Something happened at the Black Sea around 5,600 BC. Something fast, something violent, and something large enough that the people who survived it never stopped talking about it. Top 6. The Year Without Sun. In the spring of 536 AD, the sun stopped working. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It simply faded. A thick, dry fog rolled across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The sky turned a permanent dull gray. The sun, when visible at all, gave off light described by the Byzantine historian Procopius as resembling the moon, pale, cold, and without warmth. Roman politician Cassiodorus wrote that citizens were disturbed by something deeply unsettling. At noon, standing in open daylight, they cast no shadows. He noted that the seasons seemed to blur together into one endless, bitter cold. The 6th century historian John of Ephesus recorded it plainly. The sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Nobody in 536 AD knew what had happened. The source was a massive volcanic eruption, most likely in Iceland, roughly 2,000 miles north of Rome, that ejected enormous quantities of sulfate aerosols and ash into the upper atmosphere. Those particles formed an invisible aerosol veil that circled the northern hemisphere, reflecting sunlight back into space before it could reach the ground. The evidence came 1,500 years later. In 2018, a team led by Harvard medieval historian Michael McCormick and glaciologist Paul Majewski analyzed an ice core drilled from the Col Ganefeti Glacier in the Swiss Alps. Deep within the ice from early 536 AD, they found microscopic particles of volcanic glass. McCormick called 536 AD the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. The effects were immediate and devastating as summer temperatures across Europe and Asia dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees C. In China, snow fell in summer. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. In Ireland, chronicles recorded a failure of bread lasting from 536 to 539. In the Middle East, grain became so scarce that ancient records describe it being worth its weight in gold. People who had never known hunger began to starve. Then, just as the world was beginning to adjust to the darkness of 536, two more volcanic eruptions followed, one in 539 or 540 and another in 547. Each sent fresh waves of aerosols into the atmosphere. The cooling did not ease, it deepened. Scientists studying tree ring records found that the decade from 536 to 545 was the coldest on record in 2,000 years. This prolonged period of climate disruption is now known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. It lasted from 536 AD to approximately 660 AD, 124 years of suppressed temperatures, failed harvests, and weakened populations across the ancient world. Into this already exhausted world in 541 AD came the plague. Beginning in the Egyptian port of Pelusium near Suez, bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, confirmed by ancient DNA analysis, spread through Constantinople and across the entire Mediterranean basin. At the peak of the outbreak in Constantinople, Procopius recorded up to 10,000 people dying per day in the city. The plague killed a fifth of Constantinople's population during that first wave alone, and estimates for the total death toll of what became the Plague of Justinian across its initial outbreak range from 25 to 50 million people. Emperor Justinian had been on the verge of something remarkable. His generals had reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and large parts of Italy from the Ostrogoths. The old Western Roman Empire was within reach of being reunited with the East. The plague ended that permanently. Soldiers died. Tax revenues collapsed. Justinian himself contracted the disease, though he survived. The armies he needed to hold the reconquered territories shrank. In 568 AD, the Lombards invaded northern Italy, and the Byzantines could not stop them. In Scandinavia, elites buried enormous hoards of gold in the ground around this period. Historians believe the gold was not hidden for safety. It was an offering to the gods, a desperate attempt to buy back the sun. Top 7. Lake Agassiz's collapse. There was once a lake in the heart of North America, so large that no modern body of water comes close to matching it. At its peak, Lake Agassiz covered up to 440,000 square kilometers, larger than the Caspian Sea, larger than all 5 of the Great Lakes combined, and roughly comparable in size to the entire Black Sea. It sat across what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, North Dakota, and Minnesota. Held in place not by mountains or natural topography, but by a wall of ice. The remnant of the Laurentide ice sheet, a continental glacier that had once buried most of Canada under ice kilometers thick, was all that stood between this colossal reservoir of fresh water and the Atlantic Ocean. The lake had existed for roughly 5,000 years and slowly fed by glacial meltwater as the ice sheet retreated northward at the end of the last ice age. At its deepest, the water beneath what is now the city of Winnipeg reached over 210 meters. For thousands of years, the ice dam held. Then around 6,200 BC, it did not. The collapse of the Hudson Bay ice saddle, the thinning wall of ice that had been holding the lake back, was not a gradual process. It failed catastrophically. Water that had been accumulating for millennia found a path beneath and through the weakening ice and Lake Agassiz drained in what geologists estimate was a matter of months. The total volume of fresh water released into the North Atlantic through the Hudson Strait has been estimated at between 40,000 and 163,000 calendar kilometers, a figure that strains comprehension. Global sea levels rose somewhere between 0.8 and 2.8 mm almost immediately as a direct result of the drainage. But the sea level rise was not the disaster. The disaster was what that fresh water did to the ocean itself. The Atlantic Ocean circulates heat through a system called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, sometimes called the Ocean Conveyor Belt. Warm surface water moves northward, releases its heat to the atmosphere, cools, becomes denser, and sinks to the ocean floor, driving a continuous cycle that delivers warmth to Europe and the North Atlantic region. It functions because salt water is denser than fresh water. When an enormous pulse of cold, fresh glacial meltwater flooded into the Labrador Sea in the North Atlantic, it disrupted that density balance. The surface water could no longer sink. The conveyor belt slowed dramatically. The heat stopped flowing north. What followed is now called the 8.2 kiloyear event, one of the most abrupt and well-documented climate collapses of the past 10,000 years. Temperatures in Greenland dropped by approximately 3.3 degrees C within roughly 20 years. Across the North Atlantic, Europe, and much of the Northern Hemisphere, the climate lurched backward. The cooling persisted for an estimated 150 years. Forests in the Alps retreated. Boreal vegetation replaced deciduous woodland in Austria. In western Scotland, the Mesolithic population collapsed dramatically. Ancient pollen records across Eurasia, the Mediterranean, and South America all carry the chemical signature of the same sudden, synchronized climate shock. The same event most researchers believe also delivered the killing blow to what remained of Doggerland, the inhabited landmass connecting Britain to Europe. The rapidly rising sea levels from the Lake Agassiz drainage combined with the Storegga tsunami arriving around the same time ensured that Britain would never again be connected to the continent. One broken ice wall, one collapsed lake, and the map of the world changed permanently. Top 8. The Mystery Volcano. For over 3 decades, glaciologists studying ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica kept finding the same anomaly. Deep inside the frozen record of the atmosphere in layers dated precisely to 1257 and 1258 AD, there was a sulfate spike unlike anything else in the past 7,000 years. Something had erupted, something enormous. The sulfur deposited in polar ice from both hemispheres simultaneously confirmed it was a tropical eruption of staggering scale. But nobody could find the volcano. Every candidate examined, Okotina in New Zealand, El Chichon in Mexico, Quilotoa in Ecuador, was ruled out one by one. The eruption became known simply as the mystery eruption. It remained unsolved for 33 years. The answer was sitting on palm leaves. In 2013, French geoscientist Frank Lavigne of the Panthéon-Sorbonne University and his colleagues identified the source. They were led there partly by an Indonesian historical document called the Babad Lombok, a series of writings in Old Javanese inscribed on palm leaves describing a catastrophic volcanic event on the island of Lombok sometime before the year 1300. The chronicle recorded that a mountain called Samalas had collapsed in a cataclysmic eruption. All houses were destroyed and swept away. Many people died. For 7 days, earthquakes shook the earth. The royal capital of Lombok, a city called Pamatan, was completely obliterated. It has never been found. It remains buried somewhere beneath the volcanic deposits of Samalas to this day, a Pompeii of the East that no one has yet excavated. The physical evidence confirmed the chronicle. Carbonized tree trunks buried in the pyroclastic deposits on Lombok were radiocarbon dated. None were younger than 1257 AD. The chemical fingerprint of volcanic glass shards found in both Arctic and Antarctic ice cores was matched precisely to erupted material from Samalas. The eruption column reconstructed from deposit analysis had reached an altitude of up to 43 kilometers into the stratosphere, nearly 4 times the cruising altitude of a commercial aircraft. At least 40 kilometers of material was ejected. The eruption released an estimated 158 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere in a single event. the single greatest stratospheric gas release of the entire Common Era. Pyroclastic flows on Lombok reach 35 meter deep as far as 25 kilometers from the source. The flows cross the Alas Strait and reach the neighboring island of Sumbawa. In Europe, the effects arrived the following year. The summer of 1258 AD was cold, wet, and dark. The English chronicler Matthew Paris, writing from St. Albans Abbey, described a relentless north wind, unendurable frost, snow that bound the earth, failed crops, and dying livestock. Tree ring records across the northern hemisphere show dramatically suppressed growth in 1258 and 1259. Northern hemisphere summer temperatures dropped by an estimated zero point 0.8 to 1.2 degrees C. Grain prices in London surged from 3 shillings a quarter in 1253 to 15 shillings by 1258. Thousands of starving refugees from the countryside flooded into London searching for food. Many of them never left. In 1991, archaeologists excavating beneath the former Spitalfields Market in East London began uncovering mass graves. Over the course of the excavation, more than 10,000 medieval skeletons were recovered, making it one of the largest excavated cemeteries in the world. The burials were initially assumed to be victims of the Black Death, but radiocarbon dating returned dates consistently clustering around the mid-13th century, nearly 100 years too early for the plague. The skeletons showed evidence of starvation and exposure. Osteologist Don Walker connected the graves directly to 1258 AD and the famine that followed the Somalis eruption. Matthew Paris had estimated 15,000 of the poor perished in London alone that year, a city whose total population may have been around 50,000. Somalis is also considered one of the volcanic triggers of the Little Ice Age, a period of sustained global cooling that lasted from roughly 1300 to 1850 AD. A volcano erupted on a small Indonesian island, its name forgotten for 700 years, and its dead are still being dug out of the ground in East London. Top 9. The Solar Superstorm. On the morning of September 1st, 1859, a British amateur astronomer named Richard Carrington climbed into the private observatory attached to his country estate outside London. He pointed his brass telescope at the sun and began sketching a cluster of sunspots he had been tracking for several days. Then at around 11 in the morning, he witnessed something no human being had ever recorded. 2 intensely bright white patches of light erupted from the sunspot cluster. They blazed for roughly 5 minutes, then vanished. Carrington noted the time precisely and published his observations. He suspected what he saw might be connected to events on Earth, but he was not certain. He wrote that one observation does not make a conclusion. 1 or 2 hours later, the conclusion arrived. A coronal mass ejection, a billion-ton cloud of magnetized plasma hurled from the sun at extraordinary speed, slammed into Earth's magnetic field. It had traveled the 150 million kilometer distance between the sun and Earth faster than almost any such event on record. The reason for its speed was that a smaller CME days earlier had cleared the solar wind in its path, effectively paving the road. The storm that followed was the most intense geomagnetic event in recorded human history. Auroras blazed across skies as far south as Cuba, Hawaii, Colombia, and the tropics of both hemispheres. The aurora borealis was so bright over the Rocky Mountains that gold miners woke up at Wanshu in the morning believing the sun had risen. People in the northeastern United States read newspapers by the light of the sky alone. In Boston, observers said the glow was bright enough to read ordinary print. The sky over Sullivan's Island in South Carolina was described by eyewitnesses as blood red from horizon to zenith. The technological damage was immediate and global. The world's telegraph systems, the only electronic communication network of the era, failed catastrophically. Sparks showered from telegraph machines. Operators received electric shocks. In some cases, telegraph paper burst into flames from the current surging through the wires. In other cases, lines continued to transmit messages even after being completely disconnected from their power sources, running on electricity induced from the geomagnetic storm itself. A significant portion of the world's 200,000 kilometers of telegraph lines were unusable for hours. Ice core samples analyzed since have shown the Carrington event was at least twice as powerful as any other geomagnetic storm in the last 500 years. In 1859, the entire infrastructure of human civilization ran on steam, coal, and water power. Almost nothing depended on electricity. The storm disrupted the telegraph, and then it was over. On July 23, 2012, an almost identical event occurred. A Carrington-class CME erupted from the sun, composed of at least two nearly simultaneous ejections that had been accelerated to a peak speed of over 2,000 km/s, roughly 4 times faster than a typical storm. It tore directly through Earth's orbit. It was detected by NASA's Stereo-A solar observatory spacecraft, which happened to be positioned in its path. The spacecraft survived and recorded the full event. Earth did not get hit. The ignition point on the solar surface had been aimed directly at Earth 9 days earlier. The sun rotates once every 25 days at its equator. 9 days of rotation was the difference between a solar observatory collecting data and the collapse of the modern world. Researchers at NASA and the University of California, Berkeley, who published their analysis of the 2012 event in the journal Nature Communications, estimated that had the storm struck Earth directly, the resulting geomagnetic disturbance would have registered a dist value of 200 nanotesla, comparable to the Carrington event, and twice as powerful as the 1989 storm that knocked out power across the entire Canadian province of Quebec for up to 9 hours and left 6 million people without electricity. A joint study by Lloyds of London and Atmospheric and Environmental Research estimated the economic cost to the United States alone at between $600 billion and $2.6 trillion. Recovery time, according to researchers, would have been between 4 and 10 years. In 2014, physicist Pete Riley of Predictive Science Inc. calculated the probability of a Carrington-class storm striking Earth within any given 10-year period at 12%. The grid has not been hardened. The satellites have not been shielded. The warning time between detection and impact is measured in hours, not days. The 1859 storm hit a world with no electrical grid to destroy. The 2012 storm missed by 9 days. The clock, as researchers have stated plainly, is still running. Top 10. The Maya Mega Drought. Inside a cave called Gruta Zabna in the northern Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, a column of stone grew in silence for centuries. It formed the way all stalagmites form, one thin mineral layer at a time, deposited by rainwater dripping from the limestone ceiling above. Each layer captured something invisible to the human eye, the chemical signature of the rainfall that year, how much water fell, how wet the wet season was, whether the rains came at all. For 150 years, this column recorded a climate catastrophe that no written record survived to describe. In August 2025, a team led by paleoclimatologist Dr. Daniel James of the University of Cambridge published the results of their analysis of that stalagmite in the journal Science Advances. What the stone had been silently keeping told the most precise story yet of why one of the greatest civilizations in human history simply stopped. The terminal classic period of Maya civilization lasted roughly from 800 to 1000 AD. It was during this window that something irreversible began happening across the Maya lowlands. Cities that had stood for centuries and housed populations of tens of thousands fell quiet. Monumental construction ceased. The carving of stone inscriptions, one of the most reliable indicators of political activity and elite authority, stopped at site after site. Population levels in the central Maya lands declined by an estimated 90%. Major urban centers including Tikal, Copan, Palenque, and Calakmul were progressively abandoned. More than 80 distinct theories have been proposed to explain the collapse. Warfare between city-states, deforestation, soil erosion, trade disruption, overpopulation, political failure, and drought. For decades, the drought theory gained momentum, but lacked the precise year-by-year resolution to confirm timing. The stalagmite from Gruta Zabna changed that by measuring oxygen isotopes layer by layer through the stone. The Cambridge team extracted a detailed record of wet and dry seasons from 871 to 1000 AD. The first time individual seasonal rainfall conditions had been isolated with this precision during the Terminal Classic. What they found was extreme. During that 150-year window, 8 separate wet season droughts each lasted at least 3 consecutive years. The worst of them lasted 13 consecutive years. occurring roughly between 929 and 942 AD. It was the longest drought recorded in the Yucatan in the past 2,000 years of detailed record. For the Maya, the wet season was everything. Farming the lowland rainforest without reliable rain meant no maize. No maize meant no food for populations that had grown into millions. The Maya had built sophisticated water storage systems, reservoirs, canals, and raised fields specifically to buffer against drought. But those systems were designed for interruptions, not for 13 years of consecutive failure. When trusted methods of survival stopped working, the social fabric that held divine kingship together began to tear. The Maya's ruling elite derived political authority in part from their claimed ability to communicate with the gods and ensure rain. When the rain stopped coming and stopped coming and stopped coming again, that authority collapsed alongside the harvest. The stalagmite data aligned precisely with the archaeological record at individual sites. Construction at Uxmal, a major Puke region city, ceased during periods of peak drought stress. Chichen Itza, more centralized, better connected to trade networks, and with access to natural groundwater through sinkholes called cenotes, survived longer than its contemporaries. But even Chichen Itza eventually fell during a later megadrought in the early 11th century. The jungle moved back in over centuries. By the time Spanish explorers encountered the ruins in the 16th century, many of the greatest cities of the ancient world had been completely consumed by vegetation. Entire dynasties, writing systems, astronomical traditions, and architectural legacies had been buried under roots and vines. A civilization that had endured for over 1,000 years was not destroyed by an invader, a plague, or a war. It was destroyed in significant part by the absence of rain. If these stories of geological and cosmic upheaval change how you view the stability of our world, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history that time tried to bury. Help us plant the seeds for the future. Our next treasure trove of knowledge will open soon.